Hey everyone, David Chen here, and today we're going to be discussing Spider-Man Far From Home, the latest Marvel film featuring everyone's favorite web-slinger. For this spoiler-filled conversation, I'm going to be joined by Ben Pearson from Slashfilm.com and Slashfilm Daily. Really grateful to him for having this conversation with me, and again, it is going to be spoiler-filled, so if you don't want to be spoiled on anything, tune out now, come back later, watch this video when you're done. Now, one thing I want to mention is that, unfortunately, something happened during this video review. While I was recording my side of the video, my camera, the Sony a7 III, ran out of battery, and the video file got corrupted for the first half of this video. So instead of the first half of my video, what you're going to see is a series of photoshopped images that feature me and my head on Spider-Man characters, and hopefully that'll give you a sense of what my face would have looked like discussing the first half of this review. Big thanks to my friend Danish for putting these photoshops together, but sorry about that. Second half of the video should be absolutely fine in terms of my video, but hope you enjoy the discussion nonetheless, and if you like it, hit like or subscribe on this channel. There's going to be more conversations on the way the rest of this year. Thanks for watching, and without further ado, my conversation about Spider-Man Far From Home with Ben Pearson. Ben Pearson, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing today, Ben?
I'm doing great, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing well and glad to be talking with you today about Spider-Man Far From Home. So let's just talk overall thoughts before we dive into spoilers for the movie.
Yeah, I came away from this one thinking that it was a B-. I thought I had fun with it, but I was not nearly as blown away as the initial wave of positive reviews seemed to indicate. I don't know. For me, this one was fun, but not nearly as interesting or effective as Spider-Man Homecoming, which was the movie that really gave Tom Holland a chance to showcase his abilities as this MCU's version of Peter Parker. For me, this movie expands and broadens the scope in ways that I think are ultimately just interesting based on what happens in the mid-credits and the closing credits, and not necessarily for this movie itself. I have to say, I mean, I enjoyed the movie, but I think I was disappointed because I love the character of Spider-Man so much.
I found the movie to be very enjoyable, like in the moment, you know, when I was in the theater watching it. And then thinking back on it, it feels pretty more like an empty experience, if that makes sense. So I think we actually kind of like agree on our thoughts on this movie. Is that I had a great time in the movie theater. Like the audience was really riled up about seeing Spider-Man again. The characters are really likable and charismatic, and you enjoy seeing them interact with each other. Ultimately, it felt more slight than some of the other MCU films. I think the direction that they took the Spider-Man character in this one just doesn't fit super well with his depictions in the other MCU films. And we can talk more about that in a little bit. So it sounds like you and I overall feel the same way, that this movie was okay. Not terrible, but not like one of the greatest in the MCU. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
All right, so let's talk specifics then. One of the things I want to talk about is this is the first MCU film to debut since Avengers Endgame. And so this is the first MCU film to reckon with the consequences of Avengers Endgame. Obviously, at the end of Avengers Endgame, they bring back everyone who was Thanos snapped away. They actually have a name for it in Spider-Man Far From Home. They call it the blip. There were many people, including myself, that were wondering how they would deal with the consequences of that action. Because when you suddenly bring back a bunch of people who haven't been around for 5 years, and now they're suddenly back in your lives, it's going to disrupt the social order. It's going to create chaos. And this is the first movie that attempts to deal with it. And they kind of reference it. It feels very tongue-in-cheek, because a lot of the way that they deal with it is delivered via a high school student kind of news broadcast at a school, right? And there you see some other bits of it, like, for instance, Aunt May is raising money for an organization that helps to deal with displaced people from the blip. But aside from that, I felt like a lot of it was hand-waved away. Curious what you thought about how this movie dealt with the blip or the snapping or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I think this movie, it feels like it it is required to deal with it, and the way that it chooses to do so is largely through humor, which is, an effective thing in the moment. Like you were saying, I think, there's in that high school in memoriam video that they put together in the beginning of the film, you see a visual of what happens when people are returned back from the vanishing or the blip. And it shows like a band kid getting hit in the head with a basketball because they appear in the middle of a basketball game, which I thought was like a humorous visual, a funny joke.
Right.
Martin Starr's character, he plays like a chaperone who goes on this Euro trip vacation with these kids. He plays a chaperone, and he makes a joke about how his wife, or it's not a joke, it seems very serious for him, but the movie treats it as a joke, where his wife fake disappeared during the blip so she could leave him. And it just sort of, it's one of those things where those questions and the way that this movie visualizes the return in particular, it raises more questions for me. I want to know more about how that fallout impacted this world. And this movie does not have the time or the interest in actually delving into that in any sort of significant way.
This movie, Spider-Man Far From Home, introduces the character of Mysterio, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. And I'm curious, now that we're in full spoilers, did you have any knowledge of Mysterio, the character, before you went into the theater, and sort of what did you know about him going in?
Yeah, I knew that he was, from the comics and the animated series that I grew up watching, the Spider-Man animated series, that he was an illusionist, a professional illusionist who used those skills to pull off heists and things of that sort. So I suspected that something was going on behind the scenes here, that Jake Gyllenhaal's character was not all he said. That being said, and I think a lot of people going into this movie will have at least that base fundamental comic book knowledge of Mysterio.
They'll know that he's like not on the up and up, right? They'll know that there's something not quite right with him, right?
So when that twist comes and you realize that he is in fact not actually a superhero and is making up all of this and is basically like a director directing a blockbuster movie that is trying to pull the wool over the entire world's eyes, I think that part is not necessarily a surprise. The surprise in that equation, for me anyway, was that he is related in some way to, or has been impacted by, Tony Stark. And that's the big thing that these Spider-Man movies for me have done that have made them, I mean, it's sort of a weird thing, right? Because Sony is a separate company from Disney, which owns Marvel Studios. And there's this sort of like tension between this deal that they have for the Spider-Man character. They're sharing this character, right? So cynically, you could look at this situation as like Sony and Marvel don't have full faith in Spider-Man as a character by himself in this form. So they're going to introduce Iron Man in Spider-Man Homecoming as a significant supporting player in that, right? And just to sort of make sure that the audience that they want to show up actually shows up for this thing. And then in this, so that's well and good for the first way that they want to introduce Tom Holland's character outside of Civil War, right? But then in this movie, Tony is not there, and he doesn't appear in this film, but his legacy looms so large over the movie. And I think that the Spider-Man movies have become this really interesting pocket of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that really like try to reckon with Tony Stark's legacy and interrogate it in this really interesting way, like especially through the villains of these films. You've got Michael Keaton's Vulture, who was directly affected by Tony's decisions in the wake of the Battle of New York from the Avengers, who becomes this sort of like blue-collar criminal in Spider-Man Homecoming. And then in this movie, you've got Jake Gyllenhaal's Mysterio, who invented the barf technology, as they refer to it, which is like this visual like projection technology that we saw Tony use to, I guess, relive a younger version of himself, an experience of a younger version of himself in Captain America Civil War. So he has been fired by Jake Gyllenhaal's character, Quentin Beck is his name, Mysterio, has been fired by Tony Stark, and he is disillusioned, and he it's another one of these villains that is affected by Tony. And while the rest of the world is mourning Iron Man, you've got these villains who are looking at him through not quite the same rose-colored glasses that everybody else is. That sort of leads us into Peter's arc as a character, and I think he's living so much in the shadow of Tony that you don't really get the sense that he is able to live his own life. I mean, you kind of do by the end of this movie. It sort of pays lip service to the fact that he has put that behind him and he's grown as a person. But like if you trace Peter Parker's arc in the MCU, it's sort of a narrative mess. Like his motivations and decisions and I don't know, it just seems very inconsistent all the way through. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I think it is pretty inconsistent, specifically when you start with Captain America Civil War. So like whatever happened in that movie, I think we can basically forgive because nobody knew how Spider-Man would work in the MCU. I think they weren't even sure that they were going to get that character in time to make that film, right? So, okay, Spider-Man appears in Captain America Civil War, like he goes and kicks ass for a little bit and then like goes back home. Whatever. Totally fine. Freak event in this guy's life. But then in Spider-Man Homecoming, he gets a full-fledged arc where he essentially decides that he doesn't want to be part of the Avengers, right? That is the culminating event of Spider-Man Homecoming, if I recall correctly, right?
Yep.
Because he's like, I want to be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. I don't need the big glitz and the glamour of the Avengers anymore. But then in Avengers Infinity War, he kind of reverses that decision and says, I can't be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man if there is no neighborhood, which is a logical thing to say, but he's kind of gung-ho for the Avengers again. And then in this film, he is kind of trying to get away from the whole Avengers thing again, right? Like he's kind of like, you know what? I just want to take a break. I'm just a kid, you know? And while that is an extremely relatable impulse, it is kind of like this ping-ponging back and forth of he's like in, he's out, he's in, he's out. You're never sure exactly. Like he spent so much time in Homecoming trying to be Tony Stark's protege and then reversing that decision. That then for him to reverse it again in Infinity War and then have it re-reversed again in this movie just feels like I'm not really sure what they're trying to do with his character.
Yeah, the thing about it is this, for me, is one of those things that I only really think about after I walk out of the theater.
Exactly.
And I think that's because of the strength of Tom Holland's performance that, you know, you were talking about. It's relatable. He is super relatable as Spider-Man. The high school elements of this movie work really well. Those teen relationships, his relationship with Zendaya's MJ, all of that is great. And it works really well in the moment. And it does a good job of basically like hiding the inconsistencies with the character arc over the course of the MCU because it works so well in the moment.
We are broadcasting this conversation live on Periscope, and somebody in the chat room carping about brings up the fact that he's gone through a lot. He's lost 5 years of his life. He's lost his mentor. Like maybe that can explain some of his actions in this film. I somewhat buy that, but I don't know that it makes for a emotional arc that I feel fully invested in because if it can change so quickly. Do you know what I mean? From movie to movie that I don't know that I can fully kind of invest myself into it. So that's one of the problems with the Spider-Man arc is if he is able to change so quickly from movie to movie, it makes me feel less invested, right? Like the sense of his arc being kind of a continuous whole over time is lost a little bit. And I think this movie kind of reinforces that, unfortunately. But let's talk about Mysterio. Let's talk about Jake Gyllenhaal. Like, what did you think of the execution of this character? What did you think of Jake's performance?
I thought Jake Gyllenhaal was really turning the whole thing up to 11. I think he is having a ton of fun here. It really seemed like he was sort of like exercising some demons in terms of like, maybe some of the directors that he's worked with, because he's basically playing a director, right? Like that's the sort of subtext of the Mysterio character. He's a guy who's orchestrating this massive illusion for the world, and it's a lot of fun to watch him walk around in essentially a motion capture suit and like bark orders at his minions, many of whom are minor players from previous MCU movies. So yeah, I had a lot of fun watching him.
He is a blast in this film. He seems like he's having a great time. I thought he was awesome. He was the best part of this movie, and there's a lot of people that I think were doubtful that they were going to be able to make the Mysterio character work because it's such a weird, out there character, right? The whole outfit, the helmet with the like whatever, smoke underneath it or whatever.
The fishbowl.
The fishbowl, right. But I think like the whole design of the character works, and it's a little bit goofy, but they actually even comment on that in the film, right? Like he's like, "Get this ridiculous costume off me." When he is first introduced, talking about the fact that he comes from an alternate dimension, like, did you buy that at all? Like, obviously there's some subterfuge going on, but I actually still felt like, hey, maybe it's possible he is from an alternate dimension, but he's like controlling everything somehow still. Like, how did you feel that all played out?
Yeah, I think, this is a cinematic franchise that includes a talking tree, right? So like, the idea of multiple dimensions is not that far afield from that. So I think it's definitely plausible, and maybe even plausible that they introduce that idea in future MCU movies going forward. But yeah, I certainly thought that it was a possibility, but then, like you're saying, Mysterio is not to be trusted, so you sort of assume that something's up. You're just not quite sure how far the deception actually goes.
Let's talk about the action in this film. One of the things I wasn't as much of a fan of was I really felt the missing hand of the Russo brothers in this movie, because and it's not necessarily the director's fault. John Watts directed this movie. He's a very talented guy, but one thing that the Russo brothers really emphasized in their MCU films, including Captain America Civil War, Captain America Winter Soldier, and Avengers Endgame, and Avengers Infinity War, like, they really emphasized the hand-to-hand combat in these Marvel films. And I think that really helps to ground the combat in an otherwise fantastical scenario. And just because of the hero and because of the villain in this movie, like, hand-to-hand combat isn't really a meaningful thing to occur in this movie, right? Just like the setup doesn't really make sense for them to have that much hand-to-hand combat. And I felt like a lot of the fight scenes and action scenes were really CG heavy in a way that made it feel a little bit weightless to me. What do you think of the action in this film?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think Spider-Man as a character is somebody who is not necessarily built for that type of action. Like, the whole thing with web shooters is that he can attack from a distance and he can swing around, and he's very like acrobatic, and it doesn't have that same sort of tactile feel that somebody like Captain America throwing a punch would actually have. The thing about the action in this movie for me is I spent a large portion of the film thinking that the action looked weightless and worse than a lot of the stuff that we've seen in the MCU. Yeah. And then the reveal comes around where you realize that it wasn't real. It was an illusion created by Mysterio, and you've got these drones that are hidden by these projections that are causing real damage, but not in the actual way that you think that they are. So it's almost like the movie retcons itself over the course of the same movie. And I found it to be an incredibly off-putting, sort of strange experience. Maybe not off-putting, but just not satisfying. Because, yes, it technically answers the question of why everything looked kind of crappy, 20 minutes before. But I didn't find the answer.
I think you're actually being very generous to the film right now, because I think that, like, in reality, even after the drones are like, at the end when he's fighting with the drones, that still looks pretty fake, right? So and that's supposed to be real in this universe. So like, I found the CG to be, it just didn't really work for me in terms of like being hard hitting, creating a visceral reaction. Like, it didn't. Yeah. The action didn't work for me as well as even the action in like Avengers Endgame, right? Because in Avengers Endgame, you have like people like, as much crazy things that were going on in that movie, there's people physically fighting each other in that movie, right? And in this one, it's like my mind is thinking like, oh, that's a CG Spider-Man, and he's hopping from drone to drone, which are also CG, and they're destroying this bridge that's also CG. It's just like, whereas at least if there's people fighting, it's like maybe those people actually physically went and did that,
Sure. And so, Endgame also has a leg up in that, at least if the action feels a little weightless in that movie, it's more visually interesting because you have so many characters whose skill sets are so different. In this film, it's either Jake Gyllenhaal blasting a green beam at a giant elemental, or it's Peter Parker swinging around and shooting webs. So it sort of limits your visual options, pretty quickly.
Here's what I will say I liked about this movie is Gyllenhaal's performance as Mysterio, there's so much gusto in that performance. Like when he's setting up the big illusions that he's doing, it really feels like you're getting like a behind the scenes look at a theater show, and
Yeah.
he's putting on like this ultimate theater show. It's very much shades of Syndrome from The Incredibles, right? Of this guy who's faking all this stuff in order so that people may respect and revere him. And so I really liked. It really buoyed the entire movie for me. It maybe brought the movie up from like a 7 to an 8 for me.
Yeah.
Maybe even like a 6 to an 8 for me. It's just the ability to see Gyllenhaal have so much fun in this role. I thought was pretty great. So, all right. Well, I think those are like our overall thoughts on the movie. Anything else you want to mention in the movie? I actually really enjoyed the Peter Parker MJ romance. I thought like Zendaya and Tom Holland are both really well cast, and that romance plays out believably. What do you think?
Yeah, totally. I wish that she had more to do still. I know she had an increased role in this movie compared with what we saw her in Spider-Man Homecoming, but I still wish that there was some way, and I guess they tried, right, with her being able to figure out that he actually was Spider-Man, but I just wish that there was a little bit more of her in this movie because she's so good, and that character of MJ is so I don't know, like her obsession with death and things that are, dark and dreary it stands in such stark contrast to Tom Holland's like fresh-faced, wide-eyed, golly gee sort of persona.
Let's talk about the big things that happen after the movie, which is there is a post-credit sequence where Mysterio broadcasts to the world this like accuses Spider-Man of killing him, I guess, right?
And being responsible for all the drone damage in London.
Being responsible for the damage, and then reveals to the world that he is Peter Parker. And then we also see like a brief bit of J. Jonah Jameson, who's kind of, in the Spider-Man Far From Home universe, he's kind of like this Alex Jones type figure where he's, broadcasting via podcast, which is like, as we all know, the domain of kooks and crackpots.
Yes.
And it's a shocking reveal. It's kind of very much like, to talk about the legacy of Tony Stark. It's very much like the ending of Iron Man 1, but instead Peter Parker doesn't want his identity revealed. So when that happened, like, what was your reaction to that first post-credits plot sequence?
Yeah, I mean, that's a game changer, right? That goes against everything that we know about Peter Parker and how he operates, because in the comics and in the previous movies, every great Spider-Man story that I can think of has him trying to protect the people that he loves by not having the villains that he's fighting realize who he is so they can go after the people that he loves, So it's the fact that this information is now out in the world against his will. It certainly accelerates any sort of timetable that he may have had for potentially telling people on his own terms what that's going to be. And now I'm just wondering, how does Spider-Man work now in the MCU? Because Peter's classmates know, everybody knows, like Aunt May already knew, and he had a very, very small group of people that knew, but this is a whole totally different thing now. What did you think about this?
Honestly, the possibility that his identity would be revealed never even occurred to me, right? So I give the movie points for just shocking me that this would actually happen. But I think that, to be honest, Ben, the thing I felt was I was bummed that they didn't do a better job with Peter Parker's overall arc, because I feel like, imagine if like the last 4 movies that Peter Parker has been in, or the previous 4 movies leading up to this, specifically Homecoming, Infinity War, Endgame, and then the earlier part of this movie, had like put a lot of stakes into him not revealing his identity, right? Like that is very much a big idea in the Raimi Spider-Man films. But I don't know that these movies have done a particularly good job of explaining like why it's super important that his identity is not revealed. You and I understand, because like we've seen lots of these movies and we understand, like we know that there's stakes. He wants to protect those he loves. I just wish that there had been even more build up to that, and then so that when that moment finally hits, it's like even more shocking. You know what I mean?
That's totally true.
But instead, it's like his arc has been so all over the place. It's like, oh yeah, I guess. But he's like, he already accepted Tony Stark's mantle, so like maybe he's gonna be cool with it. Like I just don't even know that much.
Yeah.
Like he's already spent so much of the movie trying to like build him up as like the Tony Stark successor that maybe it's gonna be okay after all. Who knows?
What did you make of the return of Jk Simmons? Because that was like the big moment for my audience where people like lost their minds.
People started like applauding. They were super psyched that Jk Simmons returns as J. Jonah Jameson in this movie, and I mean. He is an amazing actor, and that is an indelible performance that he gave as J. Jonah Jameson in those movies. But it's a delight to see him, and I'm curious if it's going to be an ongoing role or if it's just like a brief little fun thing for the fans. That was what I was thinking. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought it was great. I thought it was sort of like if they wanted to, they could do what they did in the Bond franchise with Casino Royale and just keep Dame Judi Dench on as M, even though it's technically supposed to be, a different kind of thing, what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that I would love to see more of him because I think he's, like you said, it's just an indelible role. He is perfect. He is the only guy who could possibly play that role in that way. So I was excited to see him back.
Ben Pearson at Slashfilm.com, you wrote an article called "How Spider-Man: Far From Home Sets Up Some Unexpected MCU Movies," and I think some of this is in reference to the second post-credit sequence in Spider-Man Far From Home, right? Where you discover that the Skrulls are actually impersonating Nick Fury and Maria Hill, specifically Talos and his wife Soren, who were introduced in Captain Marvel, right? And they were originally supposedly the bad guys in Captain Marvel, but then it was revealed that they're actually just people trying to look for a new home. And in your opinion, this sets up some really interesting possibilities for the MCU, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is the chance that they try to adapt a huge comic book event called Secret Invasion, which involved Skrulls infiltrating key positions on Earth in the comics. But, with the way that Marvel chooses to adapt comic storylines into their movies, they take some huge liberties and don't necessarily adapt things in a one-to-one way. So it would have to be pretty significantly different than the comic run if they were to do something like that. But for me, I thought it was just interesting, especially with the very, very end, because not only do you have the reveal that the Skrulls have been posing as Nick Fury and Maria Hill for the whole time, you have this reveal that Nick Fury himself, the real one, is on a Skrull ship somewhere out in the galaxy. So for me, that could set up Guardians of the Galaxy 3 or Captain Marvel 2. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 seems like a movie that is going to be coming before we get a potential sequel to Captain Marvel. So the idea of the MCU expanding its footprint out into space seems like a logical place for them to go after the events of Endgame, which is, the culmination of 20-something movies that many of which have been Earthbound. And that part of the galaxy, I feel like, has been pretty well explored on film in the MCU so far. So I think the idea of them pushing outward and exploring different corners of the galaxy makes a lot of sense. We know that they have a movie called Eternals coming up soon, and I think that's going to do just that. And yeah, the idea of Guardians of the Galaxy 3, we saw at the end of Avengers Endgame, those characters are potentially going to be searching for Gamora out in the galaxy somewhere. And maybe they'll meet up with Nick Fury. Maybe they'll meet up with the Skrulls. There's all sorts of different possibilities there. But yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind.
I agree. That is exciting. This was the best kind of set of post-credit sequence I think we've gotten in a while, right? Most of them are pretty painful or inconsequential. This one actually feels like it could have some consequences, particularly the one about revealing Peter Parker's identity. I don't think there's take backsies on that one, right? So,
yeah.
We will see how that plays out for Peter Parker and Spider-Man in the future of this franchise. Any other thoughts about Spider-Man Far From Home as we wrap up today? I think we spent a lot of time criticizing it, but I still had a pretty good time. There were many memorable moments, a lot of laughs to be had in this movie. And like the high school hijinks, I just thought worked really well.
So that stuff is the highlight of the movie for me. And maybe I just wanted to get your opinion about the sort of nightmare sequence where Mysterio really like ramps up his powers, and you see like a zombie Tony Stark. That's like the most visually inventive moment in this film. What did you think about that?
Yeah, I liked that, and I also liked the reveal when you like. I think there's like multiple reveals when it's like, oh, he thinks he's out of it, he's actually not, but then he's really out of it at some point. I liked how it kind of set up these multiple. It's like waking up from a dream twice, and I like the way that the movie played with your perception of what is real. I felt the movie could have even gone even further into the psychological horror of like not understanding what is actually reality. You know what I mean? Because there's some stuff that's like when there's the sky is falling down in the form of like blades next to you, like that's pretty clearly not real. But then the thing that's so cool about Mysterio is you just never know if the situation you're in is real. There's that moment when he meets Happy by the Tulips, right? Where he's like, tell me something that only I would know or that only you would know. And it's such a disorienting experience when you don't know what is your base reality. The movie could have done more with that, but I thought what it did, the nightmare sequence, I thought that all worked pretty well. Yeah. Anyway, Spider-Man Far From Home, that's our discussion and review of it. Ben Pearson, where can people find more of your stuff?
You can find me writing at slashfilm.com. I am on Twitter and Instagram at Ben Pears.
And you can check out Ben's articles about Spider-Man Far From Home over at slashfilm.com. It's well worth reading, especially if you want to dive deep into the possibilities that Spider-Man Far From Home brings up for the MCU. I'm David Chen. Subscribe to wherever you're watching or listening to this for more content about movies and culture. Thanks for watching. See you later.